Welcome to today's AIM Center webinar. This one is specifically for workforce development programs. It's aimed to improve job training and workforce development programs. I'd like to thank some folks who are supporting us today, Leslie O'Callaghan at CAST, Mindy Johnson at CAST, as well as our captioner. Thanks to everybody for providing some support today. Some information before we begin is we aren't having anything over telephone or over audio, so please enter comments and questions in the chat window. We really want to hear from you, so please use the chat window frequently, as early and often as you wish. The webinar slides and the digital handout for this webinar are available for download, and Leslie earlier entered a link to the events page for this webinar on the AIM website. So maybe Leslie could post that again sometime in the next few minutes if you're interested in downloading the PowerPoint presentation and digital handout. The digital handout is very helpful, has lots of resources and links for today's webinar. Can everybody hear me okay? If you want to just post a response in the chat window, that would be great. Thank you. The archive and transcript for today's webinar will also be available at the same place where you'll find the digital handout and the PowerPoint for download. And lastly, we always like to remind you early on, please stay for the whole webinar so that you can also complete our evaluation at the end. There'll be a link provided. We use that for valuable feedback to improve our webinars and other technical assistance services. I am pleased and honored to present this webinar collaboratively with Sam Johnston, who is a research scientist at CAST. And Sam, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to introduce yourself before I do. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us today. As Cynthia said, I'm a research scientist here at CAST and also help provide technical assistance related to the AIM Center, mostly helping to deliver on our post-secondary and workforce development mandate. So looking forward to sharing some thoughts with you and hearing your ideas about this area and how we can help provide further resources.
Great, and this is Cynthia Currie, and I'm Director of Technical Assistance for the AIM Center at CAST. My background is in both K-12 and higher education, so my role in this collaboration is to speak most specifically to sort of a higher ed background when it comes to preparing people for the workforce and for job training, things related to transition, as well as things related to accessibility and accessibility of materials and technologies. So today's webinar, we're going to be talking about the AIM Center, giving you some background and hoping that you will continue to rely on us for support. We'll be talking about the roles of AIM and accessible technology in workforce development, as well as some AIM Center resources that you can use going forward. So with that, we're going to go ahead and ask you both to complete a poll for us. And also, be sure to introduce yourselves in the chat window. And in addition to completing the poll, if you would also say a little bit more about your job, where you are, and anything else that you would like to get out of this webinar. So if Leslie or Mindy would go ahead and administer our poll, that would be great. It's poll 7. It's in the presenter window. Great, thanks. And you might need to expand it a little bit so that participants can see. I'm looking at this from the participant perspective, so great, thank you. All right, so we have an AT specialist here, a technology accessibility. Oh, we lost our technology accessibility specialist. They changed their mind. We have a transition counselor. Actually, we have 4. That's wonderful. Disability resource counselor, a school administrator. Okay, great. All right, can everybody see the results of the poll? This is really helpful, and additionally, please be sure to go ahead and enter in the chat. I know just looking at the list of participants that we have some AIM state coordinators here as well, which is great. I wasn't anticipating that. It's great to see you. So you weren't in the survey. So go ahead, please, and add some more information in the chat window. Looks like we have some higher ed faculty in addition to those that I mentioned before. Great. So you can close the poll, please. Thanks. Okay, so a little bit about the AIM Center. Our mission is to build the capacity of states and districts that's related to K-12, post-secondary institutions, families, publishers, and workforce development agencies, who is the targets of this particular webinar, and other stakeholders to increase the availability and the use of high-quality accessible materials and technologies, which we refer to as AIM, or Accessible Educational Materials, that support improved learning opportunities and outcomes for learners with disabilities. So when it comes to the availability and the use, those are really the emphasis of our work. As far as availability goes, we work with publishers and developers, those that produce materials and technologies, and we work with them to support designing those products with accessibility built into them. And as far as use goes, we work with consumers, and that includes early learners, youth, adults, their families, their service providers, their educators, helping them learn how to acquire accessible education materials and use them. So we have multiple tiers of technical assistance for providing that service, as well as tools and resources. We build on best practice when we develop and we provide these tiers of technical assistance. Universal means that we provide resources through our website, through products, and other resources that are available to everybody 24/7. Our targeted technical assistance is we take some information from you all, from the field, from stakeholders, to help inform what we should be targeted on, and that's part of our responsive technical assistance. And finally, we have intensive technical assistance that we work with 8, what we refer to as best practices states: Alaska, Florida, Indiana. It is Indiana, Iowa, Maryland, Minnesota, Ohio, and Texas. So if you happen to be from any of those states, you are in our best practices cohort, so you have an AIM state coordinator and leaders who you can rely on. And you can go to likely either your AT ACT project or your Department of Education's website to learn more about that. Or you can always contact the AIM Center and we can guide you to them. So we're working with those states to build models of procurement and provision systems for AIM that can be available to all of the stakeholders. So accessibility, we're going to be looking at what accessibility means to materials and technologies, what assistive technology is and what role that plays in accessibility, and also universal design for learning. And these areas of accessibility are going to build up to implications for workforce development. So the functional definition of accessibility, this actually comes from a settlement agreement between the South Carolina Technical College System and the Office for Civil Rights, which is in the U.S. Department of Education. What's on the slide is a visual that conveys this term, the word accessible, and it was originally defined in this resolution agreement as when a person with a disability is afforded the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability in an equally effective and equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use. So the key terms there really are the integrated piece, substantially equivalent ease of use, equally integrated manner. When it comes to technology access, the functional definition is important. How that relates to technology access can be sort of focused in on 4 specific terms, and these are distinct terms that are related to the accessibility of both digital materials and technologies. And those terms are accessible materials, accessible technology, an assistive technology device, or an AT service. So with materials and technologies, this is really the heart of the AIM Center's work. Accessible materials are referred to as the information or the content in this particular context of learning. This could be a textbook in either print or digital format. Materials could be websites. It could be video, but it's the information and content that's being conveyed. And if it's accessible, it's designed or enhanced in a way that makes it usable by the widest possible range of learner variability, regardless of the format. So a print textbook, if it's accessible, would be provided in audio or braille, for example, for a learner with low vision. Video would be a material that's accessible if it has closed captions and it also has a video description. Accessible technologies, those are they deliver that content, they deliver the material, and it can be hardware or software. So an accessible technology could be a laptop, a tablet computer, a learning management system like Desire to Learn or Blackboard, or it could be a web conferencing system like Adobe Connect that we're communicating with today. It's usable by people with a wide range of abilities and disabilities if it's accessible, and it's either directly usable without assistive technology or it's made usable with it. And we will talk a little bit about what AT means in just a moment, but a technology that is compatible with assistive technology is key to it being accessible. So visual for that, this slide has a cartoon person on it holding a cartoon tablet, or perhaps it's an e-reader. And it's an example of accessible material with accessible technology if the content that the person is reading on that tablet, let's say it's a website, is designed to be accessible by the creator of it, and the tablet or the e-reader is designed with options for that person interacting with that website. So for example, if the user is blind, if that technology is accessible, it would have a built-in screen reader. Or if the reader perhaps has a reading disability, perhaps it has text-to-speech. If they're watching a video on that tablet, then that video might have closed captions. So these are sort of the examples of the accessible technology, and of course the material needs to be accessible as well. Some of you may be familiar with the edX settlement. edX is a provider of massive open online courses. You may better know those as MOOCs. This was a 2015 settlement. And this was the first that addressed both the need to make materials accessible. So for example, faculty and instructional designers needed to be trained in creating accessible content, and also that the technology needed to be accessible. So anything that perhaps any technology that a university or institution is expecting a student or any learner to use needs to be accessible. So an accessibility audit of the edX platform and implementation of those findings was also part of the settlement. Assistive technology is federally defined. There are two parts to it. Sometimes we forget that assistive technology is both a device and a service. AT is different from accessible technology because it's more or less a way to retrofit a technology that isn't accessible to a user with a disability. But it's not only a device or a software program, it's also a service. And the federal definition of an AT device is any item, piece of equipment, or product system, whether acquired commercially modified or customized, that is used to increase, maintain, or improve functional capabilities of an individual with a disability. So some examples of that would be an electronic braille reader, switch access for users with physical disabilities, text-to-speech, voice recognition. All of those are technologies that support a user with a particular need. But of course, as we've learned, a lot of those same technologies are useful to everybody, and many of those are being built into technology, making the technology that we can purchase increasingly inherently accessible. And then an AT service is any service that directly assists an individual with a disability in the selection, the acquisition, or the use of a device. So examples of services would include assessment of needs, the technology trials to make sure that the individual is being matched with the appropriate technology, and of course the training that goes along with it. So this slide shows an example of assistive technology connected to an accessible technology. So the AT here is a switch button, which is used by some people who have difficulty with using a touch screen. And the accessible technology is an iPad that has a switch control option built into it. If you have an iPad, you'll see this particular option under accessibility. And then, of course, the material on the iPad, in this case, would be apps. And the app that the user, the switch user, is trying to access would also have to be accessible. The switch here is known as the iAdapter 5, and that's offered by the Augmentative Communication Consulting Company. And just a couple of words about universal design for learning and how that fits into the accessibility of materials and technologies. It's important to include UDL because, as you may know, it's part of the Every Student Succeeds Act at the K-12 level. It's part of the Higher Education Opportunity Act, and it's also in the 2016 National Education Technology Plan. And the research behind UDL is based on what's known about the networks of the brain and how they relate to the ways that information can be presented to students, how we can provide options for students to express what they know, as well as how we can stimulate their interest and their motivation. Based on the UDL framework, there are guidelines that are available for designing the components of a curriculum. So these would include, of course, the goals, the methods, the materials, and the assessments. The materials component is of particular relevance to accessible materials and technologies because those materials, if they're accessible, not only ensure that individuals with disabilities have equal access, meaning that that material is equally integrated into the curriculum, that it's as usable as materials used by and technologies used by other students, but preferably it's possible that those materials and technologies are purchased in an accessible format. So when agencies, schools, states do some research on technologies that are already accessible through looking at accessibility standards, which we will discuss as that relates to workforce development, it means that that curriculum is not only universally designed, but inherently accessible, not only differentiated by goals, methods, and assessments, but also that that technology is accessible for everyone. So Sam, since you are really the UDL on campus author and have a significant role in it, I'm going to let you speak to what's available on UDL on campus, and then let you take it from there in terms of the workforce development aspect.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Cynthia. So, you know, the first part here we sort of covered what is AIM, how does AIM relate to AT, why do you need to think about these 4 different components, how do you think about them together. The next part here we're going to shift a little bit to first sort of, you know, what's the teeth now that you can put behind this to make sure that people understand that there really is a very strong and legally binding obligation to ensure accessibility in workforce development and in the workforce, and then pivot a little bit to some of our AIM resources that we think are useful. This is the first of our AIM and workforce development webinars. So another thing that would be helpful for us in the chat is if you indicate to us some of the, you know, and also follow up by email, some of the types of resources that are useful to you as you try and do your work, whether it's as a transition coordinator, as an AT specialist working in workforce development, whatever it might be. So that's just an invitation to, you know, give us some feedback about what's useful to you. Here first, we just wanted to make clear that we have, this is a higher education focused website that we've created at CAST, but it has a lot of implications for for adult education. So, if you're in workforce development, you're really thinking about the education of adults, and a lot of implications for whether you're thinking about training on the job, providing training on the job in a workforce development program, in online course, whatever it might be. It has a lot of implications for that. And what it is a suite of resources that try to kind of address how UDL can support challenges you might encounter in trying to make things accessible. So for example, there's a whole section on media and materials, and that gives you resources on, hey, I'm using images in my training materials. I'm training people on how to improve their oral communication skills as part of a job training program, and I'm using lots of images. Well, this will give you. I knocked over the plug that plugged in the phone, so apologies for that. So that UDL on campus, I'll just summarize because I don't know where I got cut off, but it's a suite of resources that can help with anything from technology procurement. So if you look under the accessibility and policy section, media and materials, so if you're thinking about using video, how do I make that accessible? How do I think about that from a universal design for learning perspective? Course design, what are some strategies I might use in designing training materials or picking training materials that are sort of broadly applicable to everybody? How do I think about assessment in universal design for learning and assessment and accessibility? And then there's a whole bunch of examples of institutions that are using UDL and accessibility best practices that you can follow as well. So that's, the goal is to sort of kind of move now in terms of what's the sort of legislation, guidance, existing centers and projects and resources that exist that kind of help really make the case, if you're having to advocate for really strongly for accessibility and universal design for learning in your work, what are some things that you can point to that actually say, hey, we can't actually afford to ignore this, and we don't want to ignore this because we want to make sure that all of the learners and all of the job seekers that are coming through our program have full access to the services, trainings, programming that we actually offer. So it's good to step back a little bit and think about, where does workforce development happen? Workforce development is a pretty huge thing. And as such, it happens in a lot of different places. So, one place that it happens really is in formal education, especially in the community and technical college space and in universities. Ultimately, a great deal of what goes on there is to prepare people for the workforce, whether that's a really immediate goal when they finish a credential or a degree, or it's a more distant goal. But ultimately, one of the purposes is to really make sure that everybody can be prepared for the workforce through formal education. Increasingly, there's a focus on online courses and credentialing entities that provide often shorter, competency-based things that align with workforce competencies. So when we're looking at those things in our workforce development strategy, how do we also make sure that those are aligning and using AIM? High school career and technical education, how do we, if we're in that space or if we're reaching into that space, how do we make sure that also addresses these issues? Workforce development happens on the job. It happens on the job in apprenticeships, in internships, in workplace training, and in actual employment, right? We're learning all the time how to do our job as we go along, how to advance, how to build new skills. And then it also happens in state and local workforce training programs. So for example, the American Job Centers, there's 3,000 of these across the country, and they have a responsibility to help job seekers actually access and prepare for the workforce. So they basically serve job seekers, those who are recently unemployed. They serve youth, adults, dislocated workers, and they offer a whole suite of services, including job search assistance, career advising, support for education and training, and in some more specific cases, they actually, can offer training. and so, workforce development happens in a great variety of places, and as we think about our strategies, we actually really need to think across these different settings to make sure that someone gets a seamless experience and they don't experience barriers in one place and then access in another. We want to think about their experience across the lifetime and across these systems so they can continually train and retrain and upskill to be in the workforce. Each of these systems has relevant legislation that requires the use of AEM, and we'll also talk about guidance around UDL, which is getting stronger and stronger as we go. So legal obligations around accessibility in formal education, the ADA, Section 504. On the job, ADA Title I covers private employers, labor unions that are often responsible for apprenticeships, and Section 503 amendments to the Rehab Act are strengthening sort of affirmative action policies. We'll talk about those for including people with disabilities in the workforce. And state and local training programs. We're going to talk about the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act and requirements there, and Section 188 that helps kind of support those requirements around accessibility and accessible education materials. So, with the Americans with Disability Act, it prohibits discrimination and guarantees that people with disabilities have equal opportunities to participate in the mainstream of American life, including, and very importantly, both education and employment. Title I really covers employment, non-discrimination in employment. Title II, state and local governments. Title III, public accommodations. And so, Title II covers public colleges and universities. Title III, really private colleges and universities. And so, like Department of Justice settlements like EdTech, where there was a legal suit brought about EdTech discriminating against individuals who are hearing impaired by not properly captioning all their videos, that would be a violation of Title III ADA legislation and the laws that protect people with disabilities to have equal access to opportunities to learn and opportunities to have job training. Title I, as we said, private employers, state and local governments, labor unions, and it really impacts all of these categories: job application procedures, hiring, firing, advancement, compensation, job training, which is really where AEM comes in place the most, but it does also in making the materials and information about the program effective and available in an equally effective manner. One of the really, really important things and more recent things that really covers and requires the use of AEM is the provision for programmatic accessibility in the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. So the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act actually brings together in a strategic and coordinated fashion the core programs of federal investment in skill development. So this is the public workforce development system. It goes out to both state and local agencies that then use funds from the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act funding to then deliver workforce development support and programs that can range from just support for job seeking information through to more intensive services for specific job seekers, including people with more intensive disabilities. It became the law in July of 2014, and all states were required to submit a 4-year workforce state plan in April 2016. So these are searchable. You can look at your state plan and see what they put in there. They had to actually specifically show how they're addressing these issues of programmatic accessibility. So if you search the state plan and just search programmatic accessibility, you could look specifically at what your state is doing or not doing, hopefully doing, but sometimes not doing, around programmatic accessibility, and you could say, hey, I'm an AT specialist, they need to be doing these additional things, or hey, I like that they're doing this, let me follow up on that and make sure that's what's happening in my workforce development setting. So that's a really good thing to go and get familiar with is your WIO state plan if you're not already. So as I said, AEM why do these two things go together like peanut butter and jelly? So now programmatic accessibility is the law, and there's an annual assessment of both the physical and programmatic accessibility required in these 3,000 American job centers. Also importantly, the state vocational rehab agencies that tend to work with people with more a need for more support around their disabilities, so more intensive needs for support, they're actually in WIOA setting aside 15% of their funding for pretty intensive transition to employment services for youth with disabilities. So you can imagine a number of those youth with disabilities require AIM to be successful in transitioning to workforce, to further training and education. And these state VR agencies are required to set aside 15% of their funding to support that process. Great place to invest in AIM because it lowers barriers to really fully utilizing those transition services for all youth. And then also there's new requirements and new work in WIOA around competitive integrated employment for individuals with disabilities. And this has become an increasingly strong focus, that moving away from an old sheltered workshop model and making sure that individuals with more serious cognitive disabilities can access competitive wage employment and need support around that. So support through the voc rehab programs and support in actually accessing competitive integrated employment. And WIOA is very focused on really coordinating with and engaging employers to improve outcomes. So employers now have work to do themselves around ensuring AIM in their workplace, so that it's not just the preparation that happens prior to employment, but the support, ongoing support within employment to make sure that people can maintain employment as well. So the part that really is key to enforcing this issue of programmatic accessibility in the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, which applies to all job centers and applies to the voc rehab system, is that Section 188 prohibits discrimination against people who apply to, participate in, work for, or come into contact with programs and activities of the workforce development system. So American Job Centers, for example, are subject to the equal opportunity provisions of the current Section 188 regulations, ensuring equal opportunity for individuals with disabilities. Many American Job Centers are also subject to Section 504 and ADA Titles 1 and 2. And by not providing AIM, that constitutes discrimination, because there's a requirement for programmatic accessibility. If people can't obtain services, supports, training in an equally integrated and equally effective manner, then frankly, they can't participate in training. So it constitutes discrimination. So, you know, the hope is that people will sort of look to this and really say, actually, there's some pretty serious consequences to not ensuring programmatic accessibility. Places like the National Center on Accessible Education Materials can help us really do this work with some of the resources that Cynthia will talk about, and others we hope to continue to provide. But there's some pretty strong teeth to not doing this, and legal obligations around it. So the important thing is that Section 188 has been updated very recently, this past December, because when it was first put together, it was technology didn't look anything like it did today. And it's been updated to address non-discrimination and equal opportunity implications that are raised in a shifting notion of workforce development, and the fact that it's a shift to sometimes partly online service delivery models in the public workforce development system, but sometimes fully online services. So job seeking doesn't happen by going and looking in a paper book anymore. It happens online. How do we make sure that that job seeking site, whether it's we're giving someone access to Monster or we're giving them access to some resume building thing, that the technologies and the materials there are fully accessible and compatible with AT devices, and that there's someone on hand who can think about the service, AT services side. And this final rule also adds a definition for programmatic accessibility, because while it was mentioned many, many times in WIOA, they never defined it. So now here it's defined. and that's a good thing to add into your own planning around your strategy for accessible educational materials. And it says policies and practices and procedures providing effective and meaningful opportunity for persons with disabilities to participate in or benefit from aid, benefits, services, and training. So it means kind of the whole comprehensive workforce development efforts that get made to let people know what's available in terms of jobs that are out there, to provide training and services and supports. And the final rule also updates the kind of auxiliary aids that people can ask for within workforce development and use, and that they're able to receive. So the other area that's really important when we shift and think about the employment side and the employer's obligations is any employers that are federal contractors or federal subcontractors. So you can imagine how many employers that actually impacts are now required under Section 503 to support individuals with disabilities. So it's really called sort of the first affirmative action policy around people with disabilities. So Section 503 prohibits employment discrimination against individuals based on disability by federal contractors and subcontractors, and it requires that federal contractors and subcontractors take affirmative action to recruit, employ, train, and promote qualified individuals with disabilities. So you can't sit back and hope they come. You have to actually do the work to make sure they do. And so some of the things tied to this mean that the new regulations of Section 503 establish a nationwide 7% utilization goal for qualified individuals with disabilities. What that means is they need to account for 7% of your workforce, because there's 7% of the population, so then not being 7% of the workforce constitutes barriers to employment that other subpopulations may not have, and that we actually need to kind of proactively try to change and address. So what contractors are required to do is apply this goal of 7% utilization to each of their job groups or to their entire workforce if they have 100 or fewer employees. So what that means is you can't be trying to make sure 7% utilization if only your entry-level jobs or your lowest salary jobs. This has to be across all job categories. So from entry-level positions through to senior management, you need to be thinking about effective inclusion and effective support in the workplace for individuals, qualified individuals with disabilities. So that might mean maybe there's a project management software that only your project managers use. Well, that project management software actually has to be fully accessible, and the content in it has to be thought through just the same way as your entry-level training materials and your onboarding materials for your entry-level staff needs to be. So there's really, really pretty broad implications for where and how we need to address AIM actually within the workforce. And then similar to the way there's the Programmatic Accessibility annual reviews and annual audits of whether that's being achieved in the workforce development system. Similarly, all contractors within the workforce, they must conduct an annual utilization analysis and assess problem areas. So if they're not hitting the 7% utilization goal, they need to start looking at why not, which really means it's a really good thing to have an AIM strategy and then be benchmarking against it to see, okay, how are we doing with implementing our AIM strategy, and what is that doing or not doing for this 7% utilization goal? Are we really lowering barriers to make sure that people, qualified individuals with disabilities, can actually fully participate as people in our workforce? We'll go through this just super quick. So the other area that's happening is obviously this, we just talked about legislation and guidance there, and monitoring. That's a new thing. There's really some monitoring around legislation and guidance to make sure that people are fully and proactively addressing the integration of individuals with disabilities in the workforce. There's also a lot of guidance now that calls both for accessibility and universal design for learning. So for example, the Department of Labor's Trade Adjustment Assistance Community College and Career Training Grants. This was a $2 billion investment in community and technical colleges over the last decade. to help them build programs in areas where there were labor shortages and a need for training people to meet those labor shortages. So this might be advanced manufacturing, it might be healthcare IT. And then everybody who got these grants, so any community or technical college that wanted to build a welding program or an advanced manufacturing program, had to make sure that all of their online and technology-enabled content, so their courses, program, their recruiting materials, developed with these grant funds, incorporated the principles of universal design for learning, and be in full compliance with the ADA Section 504 and 508 and Web Content Accessibility Guidelines Level 2.0, Level AA. So we're seeing now in big federal grants that's giving out a lot of money for people to build programs, that they're starting to require proactively that the programs use this. And so one of the big resources that's come out of this Department of Labor Investment, which is just a good resource to know about for workforce development, is Skills Commons. All of these, all the resources created with these tax funds, so this $2 billion investment, are freely available as open educational resources in the Skills Commons repository. You can search them by industry code, you can search them by institution, you can search them by topic, and you can remix, repurpose, and reuse them. So if you want to make them more UDL or more accessible or want to change them in some way, you can do it. But this is a source of a ton of career exploration materials, career training materials that hopefully you can use if it's relevant in your workforce development. And Cynthia mentioned this, but I'll just say again, UDL and accessibility have shown up as strongly recommended in the National EdTech Plan Higher Ed Supplement, which just came out, in the EdTech Developers Guide as really a best practice for education technology vendors. And so think about that from your procurement end. You need to be asking your EdTech people who are trying to sell you technology, where's your accessibility? Where's your universal design for learning? And in the Higher Ed Opportunity Act as a way for supporting pre-service and in-service teachers and for instruction within the post-secondary setting. This is additional guidance from organizations and institutions. So a nice model for having a really strong universal design for learning and accessible technology initiative is the California State University system. So if you're thinking about trying to address these issues proactively and think, how do we come up with a programmatic accessibility strategy, with an accessible education material strategy, and monitor it and put processes in place that we can sort of benchmark and look at how we're doing as we go. California State University has been really strong on that and has really emphasized accessible procurement. So making sure that any technologies they purchase or they bring into the institution are accessible from the start, and finding ways to actually check on that and have a process for, making sure that they're looking at how that happens and at how people are procuring. So it's a good model to look at that could be adapted and applied to workforce development. And then also understanding some of the work that's going on in various initiatives. So the Disability Employment Initiative, for example, these are grants that are funded to state workforce agencies who basically identify local areas to implement proven workforce preparation strategies that are developed through the Employment and Training Administration of the Office of Disability Employment Policy out of the Department of Labor. And the grantees have moved to having this a career pathway process, to supporting people with disabilities to kind of access career pathways. And a lot are using UDL in their work. So it's worth sort of thinking about, how they built universal design for learning into their processes for supporting workforce development for people with disabilities and for all people that are accessing the system and may similarly have different barriers. A lot of times what works for individuals with disabilities might be very useful for English language learners, for example, or just for people, because we're all different and require broader strategies than just one size fits all. So I'll pass it on back to Cynthia here.
Thanks, Sam. It just took my phone just a minute to unmute. Sorry for the pause. Now might be a good time to take some questions before we introduce some of the resources that the AIM Center has that relate to workforce development. Looks like we are doing really well with time, so why don't we just take a step back and see if there are any questions from our participants. Okay, so Rebecca's asking, or making a comment perhaps, colleges are still having issues with face-to-face professors posting inaccessible materials or links on their learning management systems, still issues with course materials and third-party materials such as workbooks not being accessible. So the first layer of VPAT, which is the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, passes, but not the third-party material. Yes, and I think that's an excellent comment, and Rebecca, thanks for bringing that up. Of course, a lot of that has to do with training, and under the AIM Center resources, I'll be introducing some quality indicators that are really helpful across all agencies, not just higher ed, but they're also quality indicators with components that are specific to workforce development. I think the strategy and the approach that needs to be taken is that there needs to be a system-wide provision system and a system-wide understanding about the importance of accessibility. So there needs to be both the why and the how, and everybody across the system needs to be supported with resources and support and services that will enable them to make sure that their materials are accessible. Because you're right, if a learning management system can be accessible, so that's the technology, but as soon as a faculty member adds to that learning management system a material that's not accessible, kind of overrides what is being originally provided at the system level. And Sam said, I would get the edX lawsuit in front of them. And I agree that sometimes the approach of here are some resources, this is why we should be doing it, that's sort of the right thing to do approach. But then, of course, there's the we have to do this. If we don't do this, we're leaving ourselves vulnerable to a complaint and have an experience very similar to edX. And relying on some of the settlement agreements that have already taken place. So there's the Louisiana settlement and resolution agreement that is in your digital handout. There's the edX settlement, and there are others that where there have been settlements between the Office of Civil Rights and higher ed institutions, and there have been against K-12 as well. And as part of those agreements, there are specific steps that those institutions need to take in order to prevent these issues from happening again. And those resolutions and settlement agreements can be very helpful as starting points for institutions that are looking to either create a provision system for accessible education materials and technologies, or if there's already one in place, perhaps it's not working, and they can look at those settlement agreements for some components that may be missing and that can fill a gap that may be in place in the ineffective system. All right, thanks, Rebecca. So let's move on to these quality indicators. I know from looking at some of the participants here today that some of you are longtime followers of the AIM Center, even back a few years when it was the AEM Center. And there were quality indicators for AIM. Those were specific to print materials as they related to making learning or text materials, printed text materials accessible to students with disabilities in K-12. Since that time, the AIM Center's mission has expanded beyond making print materials accessible to obviously looking at digital materials and technologies. And not only that, we're also have expanded our stakeholder group beyond K-12 to include higher education and workforce development. So based on that, we have gone through the process of updating and expanding those quality indicators so that they cross all of our stakeholders and they also address not just print materials, but digital materials and technologies. So you may recognize these 7 quality indicators if you follow them under the AEM initiative, but we have sort of genericized them so that they're not just useful or in the context of K-12, but higher ed agencies and workforce development agencies can use these as well. There are components under each of these 7 quality indicators that are really geared towards what needs to be in place. What does each of these quality indicators look like in practice? So I'll give you some examples of those as they relate to workforce development. We do have draft components of these quality indicators for workforce development. They are being reviewed, and we hope to have those available by spring. But let's just go through these, and I'll give you some examples or some preview of what you may see once those components are published. So the first quality indicator is to have a coordinated system for the provision of accessible educational materials and technologies. So an example of that is ensuring that materials and technologies that are procured at the agency level or that are selected or created at the individual staff level meet accessibility guidelines. So Section 508 standards or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines level 2.0 level AA. The second quality indicator is to acquire these materials and technologies in a timely manner. So, for example, tracking timely delivery and identifying delays. Quality indicator 3 is to have written guidelines, not only have those written guidelines, but of course there should also be implemented. So these would be guidelines that explain federal, state, and local policies that include processes for including accessible materials and technologies when appropriate in a customer's, if this is workforce development, but of course this could be student, individual employment plans, include duties and responsibilities at all levels, such as those of the frontline and the supervisory staff, IT staff, and of course purchasing and procurement staff, having the training that they need to make sure that what is purchased and procured is accessible. Good way for that to do that from the outset is to have accessibility language, for example, in contracts with publishers and developers or in purchase orders. The fourth quality indicator is to include comprehensive learning opportunities and technical assistance in your procedures. So these would be training, professional development that are offered in different forms, so orientations, workshops, briefs, and extend the audience for this training to include the people and organizations that you partner with or that your customers use for support. So contracted training providers or community college liaisons, transition specialists, employers, and in some cases families should also be part of that training and support system. The fifth is a systematic data collection process, strategies for collecting data on all aspects of your system, and this will ensure that you're providing all of your customers with disabilities the opportunity to acquire, again, definition of accessible, the same information, engage in the same interactions, and benefit from the same services as customers without disabilities. So this may be somewhat achievable through data sharing agreements with your WIOA partners that might be able to be part of that data collection strategy. The sixth is use of data to guide changes. So these would be the data that you use to gauge the effectiveness of your system. And then 7 is, of course, allocation of resources. So make sure that there are sufficient physical, human, and infrastructure resources to make all of the components of your system work and to be effective for those who are responsible for ensuring that customers, students, your clients, however you refer to those that you support within your agencies, have their accessible educational materials and technologies in a timely manner. And of course, the primary advice that we have is that whenever new technologies and materials are being procured, to really prioritize those that can be purchased in an accessible format or designed to be accessible from the outset. Other resources, the AIM Center website, of course, we have a workforce development and AIM page, and that provides some resources. Obviously, the legal issues guidance that we presented today, so you will find not only the types of resources and guidance and legal enforcement examples that Sam shared within the digital handout, but of course the AIM Center website is a good place to go for more information. We also have a resource called POM, that stands for Purchase or could be Procure Accessible Learning Materials. This resource provides tips and processes to make sure that your technologies and materials are accessible. One of those, of course, is to have contract language, and there's a sample language as part of the POM, and also VPAT examples, and that's something that Rebecca brought up. The Voluntary Product Accessibility Template is what some developers will use to self-disclose to what extent their products are accessible and meet accessibility guidelines. Task figuration is another resource. This is a good tool to share with your website developers. It is it's really a starting point or package as opposed to a retrofit solution. So be sure to share this with those responsible for your school agency or organization website. It provides resources for or framework to make sure that all the different elements of a new website is accessible. And that too is available through our website. And a link to that is in your digital handout. So I think we paused for questions, and I don't know if we had any more after Rebecca. It looks like no additional questions haven't come in. So if you have additional questions, please go ahead and post those in the chat. In the meantime, I wanted to just let you know that we have upcoming webinars through the AIM Center. One is for higher ed disability services providers and some provision processes for them, not only for providing accessible or alternative formats of materials, but also some strategies for some other technologies and making sure that materials may be purchased in accessible formats within the institution. Some models of AIM and higher ed system accessibility policies. That Sam referred to the California State Accessible Technology Initiative, so that's one example of those models. We will have a panel that will give us an overview of what has worked within their colleges and universities. And AIM in the IEP, that's for K-12 folks, but of course also has implications for anybody who's involved in the transition of students at the K-12 level into either the workforce or higher ed. And of course you can stay connected with the AIM Center through our website. I know Mindy earlier posted that you can connect with us through multiple social media outlets. So thank you so much for participating today. Sam, do you have any closing thoughts before we post the evaluation?
The only thing I would say is that, we would love feedback, whether it's over email or however you want to give it, on what's helpful to you, what you'd like to see, what kind of resources you need, because the workforce development mandate to support workforce development and AIM is a new one for the AIM Center. It wasn't part of CAS ran the old AIM Center. So it would be really great to hear back from you all what you're looking for, because then that gives us a chance to try and respond accordingly.
Great. And I would also just like to thank again those who provided technical support for us. As you can tell, you never know what's going to happen during a webinar, and we have really quick, excellent technical assistance. And also would like to thank Brooke, our captioner today, who obviously made this webinar, supported the accessibility of this webinar, also really modeling accessibility of material and technology. So any final comments can certainly come in. When the webinar closes, you will be taken directly to a link for today's evaluation. There's also, maybe for some reason, thought as presenter I could bring the web link over to the main content area there. Thank you. That was magical. You can also connect to the evaluation, perhaps if you have your pop-up block through the digital handout. For today, it's also in there. It's also provided in the web link pod that should be visible on your screen. If you click on the name of the link, you will the Browse To button will become available, and you'll be taken to the evaluation that way. So you're welcome to do that. The evaluation is available in the digital handout or upon the closure of this meeting. So we get you multiple directions. We really value your feedback. Thank you so much.